morning and welcome back, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, there have been claims in the media that Muslims are being targeted by banks and some foreign embassies. Here to shed some light on this is attorney Nafisa Muhammad. Good morning and welcome.
Very pleasant good morning to you and to all your viewers out there. Assalamu alaikum, namaste and good morning.
Thank you so much for coming this morning. It's a pleasure having you.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, I'd like to ask you, what reports have you received as it relates to Muslims being targeted?
Yes. In recent times, there have been several reports that I have received and become aware of involving persons from the Muslim community who would have been experiencing some difficulties and challenges. I know of a couple instances of individuals who actually had, for example, US visas, and they were called in and their visas cancelled for whatever reasons. And as well, in one particular case, I'm aware of the fact that one prominent businessman, several of his bank accounts had actually been closed down. And in trying to analyze the reasons or the processes that are involved and what steps can be taken, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are operating in an environment now. As you would appreciate, countries throughout the world are putting in place legislation and measures to help to make countries safer and citizens safer because of what we have been experiencing. We are in the age of information, we are in the digital age, and we know that there has been a war on terror that is operating globally, and given the several new international conventions and treaties that countries throughout the world would have come together and signed on to. And given the fact that in our own case, in our country, our laws have been changing, and it has been, over time, we have been evolving in terms of modernizing our legal frameworks in order to deal with the new realities and the new challenges that are being experienced. And in that process, I think it is critical for us to be more aware and more sensitized to the need to ensure that with these new laws that are coming into place and the reforms that are taking place, that we ensure that at all material times that the rights of our citizens are protected in a way that you can ensure that there are mechanisms and provisions in place to provide for due process to take place and for citizens to have the opportunity to be able to clear their names or clear the air if it is that the authorities are, taking steps to put some pressures for whatever reason. Because what I've experienced firsthand is that with this, for example, in our country, Trinidad and Tobago, since 2001, we have signed on to what is known as the Transnational Organized Crime Convention. And that is an international framework that deals with a lot of new challenges. You have countries now putting in place domestic legislation to deal with some of these issues. For example, you have money laundering, you have anti-corruption measures, you have issues involving trafficking in persons and refugees, and you have issues involving terrorism or counter-terrorism measures. And whilst that has been happening, you had the events in 2001 with the September 9th events, which would have led to the United Nations Security Council approving a resolution, and countries all over the world, including Trinidad and Tobago, would have been signatories to these resolutions and would have agreed to change the laws in the country to put in new measures. So that since that time, we have had in 2005 an Anti-Terrorism Act that was passed. It was substantially amended in 2010. It was amended again in 2011, 2012, 2014, and more recently, just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, our Parliament would have been involved in an intense debate on further amendments to the anti-terrorism laws. Now, whilst those laws were being discussed and being reformed and so, you also had the emergence of the Financial Intelligence Unit. The FIU is based on legislation that was passed in the Parliament. So that what you now have in our country and in our system, and it is interesting because today, for example, I understand that the government will be revealing a new crime plan. But in light of what we have been experiencing in our own situation here in Trinidad and Tobago, I would like to know to what extent has there been a proper analysis of the situation that we are experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago, so that the laws that were passed already and measures that are being implemented, so they would be put in place based on an informed position, having done the research to know the nature and extent of the problems that we may have, that these new pieces of legislation are trying to deal with. That is a concern that I have. I know, for example, with the Financial Intelligence Unit, when that legislation, it has been in the pipeline for quite some time now, it is the law, and there are different agencies of state that come into play in dealing with the issues that the FIU will be looking at, would be concerned about. You have the Ministry of Finance playing a key role. You have the Ministry of the Attorney General having a key role to play, and the Ministry of National Security. So that when these three different ministries now have to be involved in dealing, and the FIU will be monitoring suspicious activity and transactions through the banking sector, and they will have their own mechanisms. And in that process, the coordination of the efforts and the opportunity for citizens who might be impacted on or be, if a red flag is put up for whatever reason. Some time ago, I remember the Honorable Attorney General had said publicly that the FIU's report indicated that there was some $22 billion of suspicious activity in our system for a very short period of time. Now, if it is that the FIU has picked up that kind of information, and the country has been made aware of it, then in terms of how you are tracking and monitoring these activities, you have to have a proper mechanism in place to ensure that you are able to sift out meaningfully. As an attorney at law, I know, for example, that in the legal practice these days, when it comes to a simple thing like registering a deed of conveyance, because of the money laundering issues that we are confronted with, the whole system has changed. And whether it has become more efficient, there are huge question marks on that note, because there's a need to look at the processes and the systems and ensure that they are also modernized to keep in sync with the new legal frameworks. Otherwise, you run the risk of imposing hardships on individuals who would be very innocent of any kind of, offense. And, the training of the people who have to implement these new laws is an area of great concern that I have as well. Because, we have just witnessed some situations here in our country which was unprecedented. And you have so many different new units and new agencies that are operating. And the coordination of these units and agencies is a vital part of the new processes that ought to be, operating in a very efficient manner. And my observations, just my own personal observations, is that a lot of attention needs to be paid in that regard. You have within the police service, for example, several units and organizations. The law enforcement agencies have been trying to grapple with the challenges. We have a huge crime problem in our country, and as citizens, we all want to see our agencies succeed in keeping us safe and secured. And it's just that what is happening, you can tell that there's a need for some attention to be paid to ensure that our officers are properly trained and have a good understanding of what really is happening at the ground level in our country. And that is where I think there is a big gap in what is operating at present, because some of the new laws that have come into being, it has happened against a background where a proper analysis has not yet been done to know how some of these things are happening. And there's a misplaced focus, which has led to a lot of, concern, a lot of fear has been instilled in certain communities. Look at these reports that I have indicated to you from my own information. I mean, you are dealing with persons who have established businesses, generating a lot of income and contributing towards the economic growth of the country. And if it is that their business depend on doing business abroad with other entities, and now if the bank has seen it fit to close their accounts, then look at the hardships you are imposing on these entrepreneurs in our society, and on what basis. In one case, one of the businessmen who I happen to have met personally, I mean, he's somebody who is well known in the Muslim community, who has contributed within his family alone. They would have contributed a couple $1 million towards the construction of a masjid and other facilities to benefit the community. And, it is part of the day-to-day operations in the Muslim community. I mean, there's an extensive system known as the Zakat system, a compulsory pillar of Islam, where you are required to give a percentage of your earnings towards helping the poor and the needy, so that throughout the nooks and crannies of our country, we have this system operating. Now, with this elaborate procedure enshrined in the law now, whereby entities, for example, through the United Nations, they now have a list of entities. If it is that globally they have identified companies or corporations that have question marks in terms of whether they are contributing or financing terrorism or so, this recent law that was passed will enable the Attorney General to go through a procedure through the courts whereby you can have the various entities that have been identified listed, so that these are the types of mechanisms now that we need to focus on to ensure that in so doing we have a mechanism as well whereby if you have cause for concern with anybody in the country, any citizen of ours, then give them an opportunity to come before a tribunal or some committee and bring their documentation and clarify any issues you may have.
We'd like to continue this conversation right after the break. I'd like to talk a little bit about those reports that you received and also what reasons were given. Were they valid in terms of the actual freezing of the account and that sort of thing? All right, so we take a short break, a lot more when we return. Well, we continue with the program. As we mentioned earlier, we are discussing claims in the media that Muslims are being targeted by banks and some foreign embassies, and we are joined by attorney Nafisa Mohammed. Ms. Mohammed, we started that conversation earlier. You mentioned that according to your information, several businessmen have reported that their accounts had been frozen. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the reasons. Were there valid reasons?
No, this is the point. In terms of the reasons identifying why it has been closed, and so we are still trying to ascertain the reasons why. And the mechanisms for ascertaining is what is a very gray area. Because, I mean, it will entail eventually having to probably go to the courts and seek an order. But this is what I think we need to be paying some attention to. Through the FIU, through the Office of the Attorney General and the Ministry of National Security, I think there needs to be a deeper dialogue taking place so that we can help to come together and determine or develop a mechanism that can be used to help to verify or clarify a particular situation and do it in a very prompt and efficient manner.
What are your thoughts on the anti-terrorism legislation?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion that recently took place. The debate just concluded in both houses of Parliament, and I have said publicly that I was really very pleased to see the manner in which all parliamentarians engage in the dialogue. From the original bill that had been laid in the parliament since 2017 to the bill that was relayed in January of 2018, some amendments were made to the piece of legislation. And whilst this is a piece of legislation that had to be enacted because there were some sanctions if the deadlines were not met, and the Attorney General should be quite happy that he has been able to get it through the Parliament. At the end of the day, there is still a huge gap that, in my respectful view, that has not yet been filled.
In what areas?
And I'm saying this because this law, if it is that there was the UN resolution that had been approved since 2014 under the previous administration, which would have committed the government to having to enact legislation, if that is the case. One of the things that has been happening with that kind of legislation, and so I was just reading an article, for example, in England, where an independent review QC, in looking at the legislation in England, he was actually saying that these laws are not going to help with the issues that you have to deal with. In Trinidad and Tobago, the gap that I am very concerned about is that this legislation was laid in the Parliament, but where was the policy document to inform this legislation? If you want a good law, it is a basic principle that you come with a good policy. And the way how this discussion unfolded, it was after the horse had bolted out of the stable, in a manner of speaking. At the end of the day now, there were some amendments, but things were happening in a vacuum. If we are saying that you want to give powers to the authorities to designate areas, geographical areas, for whatever reason, and you have a procedure, you are creating new offences, you are stiffening the penalties, you are giving powers to the Honourable Attorney General to deal with the FIU and to deal with some of these so-called offences. Then tell me, what is the nature and extent of the problem of terrorism that we have here in Trinidad and Tobago? I know we have a huge crime problem, but to me, our existing laws and our existing legal frameworks, under these laws, there are mechanisms in place to deal with criminal situations. Now, if you are saying that we have a problem involving terrorism, what is the analysis that you have done to identify? If you are saying that people, because we know that this legislation was based mainly on the resolution that dealt with foreign terrorist fighters from 2014. It's a UN Security Council resolution dealing with persons who would have been traveling from all over the world to go to the conflict zones, particularly in Syria. My exposure at the ground level now in our country with respect to the Muslim community is that for many, many years we have had Muslims who have been leaving this country just as citizens would leave to go to New York or go to Canada or go to London for a better way of life because the pastures appear to be greener. Nearly 20 years ago, I went to court to fight for custody for 2 young children because the father wanted to take these children and send them to Egypt to live with 2 of his other wives because he felt that the environment here was not suitable, not in an Islamic environment. Okay. So for some time we have had a movement of persons going to different parts of the Muslim world. For whatever reason, we need to do that analysis and identify who have gone, who have left, why they went, who they went with, if women and children are involved, who are dead, who are alive. And let's continue the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Nafisa Mohammed.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, news is up next. Stay tuned.